everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Sisser. I'm the Executive Director of the Hancock Historical Museum here in Findlay, and I'm honored to be the one to welcome you to the start of a community-wide and day-long celebration of freedom here in Findlay, and that is in commemoration of Juneteenth. It was on this date, June 19th in 1865, that Union soldiers landed in Galveston, Texas, to tell the enslaved that they were free, and that was actually 2.5 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So what began as an anniversary celebration in Texas spread throughout the country, and today, Juneteenth celebrates African American history, freedom, and respect for all cultures. This year's local celebration of Juneteenth was initiated by the Mazza Museum here at the university. Mazza's Miles of Bravery exhibit is a collection of original artwork from children's books about the Underground Railroad. And that artwork will be displayed at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center and several other locations throughout our state next year. But today, you have the opportunity to view that art first here in Findlay. The original artwork has been divided up among all of the participating organizations today and is on display throughout the city. After our lecture today, we will be giving you additional information about the activities that are happening at the other participating locations, and we certainly hope that you will take the opportunity to visit them as well. I want to recognize a special guest in the audience today. We have one of the illustrators of that artwork with us today, Lowry McElrath-Eslick. Would you stand for just a moment, Lowry, and be recognized? Thank you, Lowry, for being here. I also want to say that the Findlay-Hancock County Convention and Visitors Bureau helped to really organize the participating organizations around this idea of creating a larger Juneteenth celebration of freedom. I certainly want to thank the Mazza Museum, and in particular Carrie Teeple, Danielle Wilkin, and Alyssa Preston with the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and also our other participating organizations for all the work that they put into organizing this event. And those organizations include the Black Heritage Library and Multicultural Center, the Findlay Art League, Findlay-Hancock County Public Library, the Hancock Historical Museum, Marathon Center for the Performing Arts, of course the Mazza Museum, and Paint and Partake downtown. And again, we'll go through that list with you at the end of our lecture today and guide you to some of the other locations throughout town. Well, now I'm going to hand it over to our red coat ambassadors, although I noticed that that's a very good choice in the summer to do the red polos instead of the coats. I'm sure that's much better for the weather. And we'll do a ribbon cutting to kick off today's festivities. Oh, I am doing the ribbon cutting.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting us. I speak on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce Ambassadors that we are honored to be able to take part in today's event. The Chamber Ambassadors would like to thank the Arts and Heritage Council and the University of Findlay's Mazza Museum for having us today to celebrate this Juneteenth. We appreciate their investment and interest and acknowledgement of this historic day. Artwork from the Mazza Museum, Miles of Bravery, the Underground Railroad, through picture books, will be on display at several locations today around the city as part of the celebration. So at this time, I'm going to hand it over. We're going to do a count of 3, and we're going to cut the ribbon so we can then get the celebration started. If everybody wants to join in with that. 1, 2, 3.
We have with us today our mayor, Christina Mirren, and she'd like to say a few words.
Thank you all for taking the opportunity to come here today and not only recognize the history and the importance of today and the freedom that we received across our nation, the importance. But definitely, I appreciate Mazza taking the lead on putting this together. Artwork is a medium that allows everyone to participate, whether it's someone later in their life or later this afternoon there's going to be children activities. It's a way to understand our history at kind of every level, and I think that that's a great opportunity to recognize the importance of that in our community and what it means today. So thank you for taking the opportunity to come and learn. Thank you especially to you and for using your talents to convey and educate individuals. So that's something we definitely want to recognize here in the city of Findlay. So thank you for being here today and continuing to spread the word of the activities that we have and the history that our community holds. So thank you.
Okay, well, now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Cathy Nelson. Cathy is a retired educator from the Columbus City School System with over 36 years of service. She is the founder and president emeritus of Friends of Freedom Society, which is a 19th century historical research organization, and their main focus is the research of the Underground Railroad. Ms. Nelson has testified in Congress on behalf of the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Act of 1997, and she and her extensive research have won numerous awards and widespread recognition. I have the honor of serving on the Ohio Humanities Board of Directors, and Cathy is a member of the Ohio Humanities Speakers Bureau, and she has served in that role for nearly 2 decades, and I know that she has consistently been one of the most popular speakers with the Speakers Bureau. So Cathy, we are honored to have you with us today, and would you please help me to welcome Cathy Nelson?
Hello, Findlay. It's an honor to be here. I haven't been here in years, and so I am very pleased to be back in Findlay. I've always had a great town here, and I have been to some of the places that Sarah mentioned, some of the other museums. I have not been to hers yet, but I'm going to get down there and see that. So I am pleased to see all of you here, and we're going to take a journey today as you are finishing up your lunch and seeking freedom, Ohio and the Underground Railroad. And I'm going to start here. Is it possible to cut down maybe one light or so, or if you can, maybe help see the images a little better? I always start this journey from south to north, and I start in Kentucky. And the reason why I started in Kentucky is because Ohio and Kentucky are only separated by what was called the liquid line of freedom, the Ohio River. So the day that I am here in Augusta, Kentucky, I have gotten on a ferry boat and I have been ferried down to a tavern, old warehouse, had been there since the late 1700s. And the person who owned the house told her story of how slaves would be brought down on the boats and to be sold there in Kentucky. And so while I'm there, I find another site, Sebastian Schroff Plantation. This is a private home now. And it's an interesting story that goes with the Schroff Plantation home. All that's left of this property is the house and what used to be a smokehouse out back. Sebastian had slaves, and he had a slave couple with a young child, an infant actually. And this enslaved couple tried to run away, and they were caught and brought back, and their punishment was that the infant was taken away from them and kept with them at night in their bedroom, knowing that these two enslaved people would never try to run away again because Sebastian had threatened them that he would sell their child. Now, a free black man who was living across the river in Ripley, Ohio, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit, and you may have heard about this person, John Parker. John Parker heard about this story. He heard about this couple, and because he had his own boat, and because he was also helping runaway slaves to get across into Ohio, he took a chance and he went down to this property. He found this couple and he tried to convince them to let him help them to freedom. They said no. Shrove has taken our baby because we tried that before. Leave us alone. He promised them, just listen to what I say and do what I say. I will get you and your child to freedom. So one night, he goes down to his house. He slips in the back of the house. He goes upstairs. Shrove and his wife are asleep in the bed. There is a gun beside the bed on a table and a very short tallow candle. And he finally sees the bundle, and that's the baby. He tosses something at the candle, the gun hits the floor, and in one fell swoop, he grabs that child, and he's out the door before Shrove can get to his feet and realize what happened. He reunited that baby with the couple and got them across the river to a safe haven. Still in Kentucky, I can now see Ripley in Brown County. It was called the hellhole of abolition because the only thing that separates the bounty hunters from the abolitionists is the Ohio River, this liquid line of freedom. And that little house, that's where we're going to in a moment. So I'm now in Brown County on the other side of the river, and I'm at John Parker's house. John Parker was that free black man who had gone over there and helped that baby and their parents escape. John Parker had been enslaved as a young child in near Richmond with his mother. He was sold away from his mother at age 8. He was chained to a coffle of slaves who were on their way to Mobile, Alabama on foot. He never saw his mother again. And the old man who he was chained to was whipped to death, still chained to this 8-year-old. When he makes it to his destination, as he grows, he's very, very pent up with anger, but as he grows, he's very intelligent. He can do a lot of work with his hands, and so over time, he is hired out by his owner to work, and he's able to save a little money. He has, of course, to give some of the money to his owner, but he's able to pocket some of that money. His last owner was a woman, and she told John that for $1,800, I will give you your freedom. He was able to raise $1,800. I find that extraordinary in the 1800s to raise $18, let alone $1,800. He buys his freedom. He heads for Indiana. He stays in Indiana for a while, and then he comes to Cincinnati. That's where he meets and marries his wife. But he doesn't like Cincinnati. He doesn't feel that the spirit in Cincinnati was right. He's probably right, but that's another story. So he comes to Ripley. He builds his house right there on the river. Now, if you see those steps, I can stand on those steps today and toss a rock in the Ohio River. That's how close the water is. We thought this house would fall down years ago. It never did. It was flooded by rains, but it was like it had its own spirit, that it refused to fall down. In horrible condition. You see the river. That whole side of the house was open. Today, it has been restored. It is the John P. Parker Museum and Educational Center. If you have never seen any Underground Railroad stations, I would encourage you to take a journey to Ripley, Ohio, to see this site, and there are other sites there as well. That side that was open is now closed, and thousands of school children go there during the school year, as well as hundreds and hundreds of adults go there as well. It is a national landmark. John Parker had a $2,000 bounty on his head. He never kept runaways in this house. He got them to freedom, but people knew what he was doing. So he would never allow his house to be used if he could avoid it. And most of the times he tried to get them to another safe haven further north. Now, that little house I pointed out to you a little bit ago up on that hill, that was Reverend Rankin's house. John Rankin was a Presbyterian minister. John was born in Tennessee. His parents were abolitionists in Tennessee, and they moved to Kentucky when Reverend Rankin moved to Kentucky with his wife. And he lived in Kentucky for quite some time, and he was a member of the Kentucky Abolition Society, which I found very interesting in Kentucky. He had a church, and he preached at the church, and he also taught enslaved children how to read and write, which was totally against the law. So, as I said, he's a minister of the church there. And on one occasion, the authorities told John that perhaps he would feel welcome elsewhere. And he decided that that might be a threat, and he left. And so he comes to Ripley, Ohio, and this is where he first lives. Now, this house was always built for 3 families, so it hasn't been changed. So he lived there, and he had a brother living in Virginia who was very pleased with himself when he wrote a letter to his brother and said that he had gone to auction and he had purchased some slaves. And this absolutely sent Reverend Rankin over the top, because he could not believe that his own flesh and blood would purchase slaves in auction. But he did, and so he writes a letter to him. And over the time, he writes more letters, and these letters would later on be published in the Ripley paper called The Castigator. I love that name. And so he decides, I can't live down here anymore because what I'm about to do is going to be too obvious. So he moves up on the hill. And there's an old pencil drawing, ink drawing of Liberty Hill. That's what his site became known as, and that was drawn by Henry Howe. Many of you probably know him, wrote many, many books about Ohio's history in 1846. But that's the Rankin House. Has anyone ever been to the Rankin House in Ripley? Good, a couple people. There are 100 steps to lead to the house. When the Rankins owned it, there were, of course, other outbuildings on the property. This is now run by the Ohio History Connection, once called used to be called the Ohio Historical Society. And John Rankin was credited for helping 3,000 runaway slaves to freedom. He had, I think, 12, 13 kids, so there were always enough kids in the house to assist with things. And so he comes to that area in 1828, and that's where he would live. And that was sort of an outpost for watching for those crossing the river. So Reverend John and his wife Jean Lowry there. And one of the areas that would be a safe haven for runaways was this door leading down below the house, or the undercroft of the house. I'm sure some of those outbuildings that were on the property at the time were used as hiding places too. He always kept a lantern in the front window. So if you saw that light in the lantern, that meant that John Rankin was saying it is safe to come. If you do not see that, then that means bounty hunters are on the prowl. Do not come here. The old steps are still there, and I have been to the site countless times, and I still stand up there on the top of that hill, and I look over the expanse of the Ohio River, and I see Kentucky on the other side, and I still wonder, how did they do it to make it across that river at night, get up 100 steps? How did they do it? Sheer determination and perseverance. And there's really nowhere that you can stand in downtown Ripley, Ohio, and look up and not see Liberty Hill. It's been restored. In 2014, the Ohio History Connection had it restored the way it was when Reverend Rankin and his family lived there. So I'll go through these pretty quickly. They did a great job. They found the original patterns of wallpaper and flooring, and all that's been done. I thought, boy, for a Presbyterian minister back in the 1828s, he's living pretty good. But there's a panoramic view of the Ohio River, and of course, Kentucky's on the other side. And you can walk down the newer steps, and a great shot for taking pictures. And he's buried in the cemetery there in town. But there's another story in Rankin that you don't hear about, and that's still in Ripley, Ohio, but it's the Little Africa settlements. And there are a number of settlements around Ohio called Little Africa. And Aunt Rilla Jones here, after the Civil War, posed with her dog because she proudly said that she was an agent for the Underground Railroad, and her area of Ripley was where free blacks would come and live, and where runaway slaves were coming to. Very little left of Little Africa. I had hoped that the National Park Service would have done an archaeological dig at this area as they did at the Parker House to see what they could find today. Nothing but remnants of foundations of Little Africa are still left. But still in Brown County, I haven't made it out yet because I'm still in Brown County, and I'm at the Thomas Collins House, who was also an Underground Railroad conductor when he had to be. He made wagons and coffins. And on one occasion, John Parker had some runaways with him, but it was becoming daylight, and he knew he had to get them somewhere. He could not take them to his house, and because activity on the water was starting to happen. So he comes to Thomas's house, and Thomas is, shocked that he would be at this house at this time in the morning. He says, John, what are you doing? You can't be here. He says, I've got to get them hidden somewhere. Please, can you take them in? And he had just finished making several coffins. So you probably know where I'm going with this story. So he has the runaways put in these coffins. Thomas loads up his wagon with the coffins, with the people inside, as if he's going to the cemetery for a funeral. The bounty hunters that had finally gotten over there saw him with the coffins. They stood there, they'd bow their head and tip their hats out of respect, and Thomas Collins went on about his way with the people who were seeking freedom. Now I'm over in Preble County, very close to the Indiana line, in the middle of nowhere in Israel Township at the old Hopewell Church. This church was built in 1814 by Reverend Porter. Reverend Porter was from South Carolina. Reverend Porter had slaves, and he had freed his slaves and brought these freed people with him. And he built this church. He had a church in South Carolina, and he came here to Ohio and built this church and brought his freed people with him, and they worshiped in this church. Now, there was another man from South Carolina who was a member of his church there, and he sold his slaves and came to Ohio. And he found Reverend, the minister, Reverend Porter, and said to Reverend Porter, Pastor, I've sold my slaves. I've come to join your congregation. Will you accept me? He said, I will if you go back and buy your slaves, free them, and bring them here, and then you will be accepted into the church. And this man did just that. The bench that the freed people sat on, a very long bench, still is in the back of the church, and that's where the freed people worshiped there. Still can be seen. Still in that area is the Bunker Hill House. This is the most amazing tavern lodge that I've seen that was a part of the Underground Railroad. As I speak, it is being threatened by a solar plant that wants to be built there, which would cause a lot of damage to the undercroft of this building. So we're trying to fight that from happening. So here in Fairhaven, one of those free black people who worshiped there at the church worked here, and that was Gabriel Smith. Now, Gabriel Smith lived in the tavern. He lived there in the Bunker Hill house. And if you see this open door here, that leads underneath these steps. That's where Gabriel would sleep. He had a little pallet, and he would sleep right underneath these steps because that window here pointed out to the creek. And he would always be watching for runaways coming along the creek so he could get them into the Bunker Hill house and get them down below is where he would hide them until he could get them further to a safe place. Many times that was really close to Indiana or going into Indiana. I am in Darke County, still on that very western edge. When I come to a triracial community, whites, blacks, and Native Americans all living here in this area in Darke County. It was called Longtown, and this is the James and Sophia Clemens house. And they were very active African American Underground Railroad conductors. That was quite the community, and this community has been featured in a number of newspapers across the country for having this type of operation going on in their area, and Native Americans, whites, and blacks all working together to help those who are seeking freedom. And now I'm in Warren County at the Henry T. Butterworth House. These are Quakers, and this is called the Old Stone House. And at the time I was there, it's been years and years ago. I'm sure she's deceased now, but it was the great-granddaughter of the conductor. And so in this area here, this is where she took us. And she said, in here is where my great-grandfather could hide maybe 8 to 10 slaves, no more. They could hide in there. And she says, the dirt floor that you're standing on is still the same dirt floor that was here when my grandparents were alive. She says, but when the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 came out, they stopped taking escaping slaves to freedom because of that law. But when they would take them for 1 penny toll to Lebanon, Ohio. And now I'm at the Jonathan T. Wright House, still in Warren County, but in Springboro. Jonathan T. Wright came from the East, and he was an Underground Railroad conductor in the eastern part of the country. And he founded Springboro, and when he came here, he already knew what he was going to do. So he had a little room up in the attic. It's not even a room. I mean, it's just a little spot in the floor with a ladder that he used when he was hiding runaways. It was, and I'll show it to you here. I've been in it, and it's temporary. You can only hide in there for so long. And then he had other family members that had moved to the area, and he would try to get them to some of those other family members and get them further away. The last time I was there, I think this house has now become a bed and breakfast, but the last time I was there, the homeowner said, well, do you want to, see the hiding place? And I said, well, sure. And he said, well, this time when you see it, he says, be very still because there are about 1,000 bats hanging over your head. So I've not been back since. But I'm glad he warned me. This is probably the oldest house in Dayton, in Montgomery County. The old Dandridge house is because a family named Dandridge lived there, but it was also referred to as Wolf Creek. Now, the reason why is because this side of the house, when it was being used as an Underground Railroad site in the 1880s or 1800s, this was the back of the house. Today it's the front, but then it was the back. because what is called the back of the house today was the front of the house then. Did I just totally confuse you? Because this was the side that faced Wolf Creek. And so those crossing the water, and we know that, people were crossing the water many times trying to get in the water so bounty hunters' dogs could not smell their scent. And I'm sure many of you already know that. But the members who lived there the family who lived there were United Brethren, members of the United Brethren. And so they had a wall in this house that could literally raise up, and runaways would be taken in there and hidden until they could get further. This is the George and Sarah Gammon House. This is a home that was owned by George and Sarah, a black family. This house was in total disarray in the mid-1990s. In fact, the first time I saw the wrecking ball was parked across the street. It was going to be torn down, and as Sarah mentioned, I testified before Congress about the Network to Freedom Underground Railroad program with the National Park Service, and their congressional representative had signed his name. I think it was Hopkins. I think that was his name. He had signed his name to that bill, and so I got a desperate call to come to Springfield because they were going to tear this down. And so when I got down there, I talked to the city manager. I said, it would not look good for you to have this building torn down. Yes, I know it is in horrible condition. I hope at some point in time it will be restored. But there are very few houses still standing that were part of the Underground Railroad that were owned by black people. And I said, and it's very important that these types of sites be saved. And I says, and it wouldn't really look good because your congressional leader has signed his name to the bill. So, you can do what you want to do, but... So, I think he thought more about it, and he didn't tear it down, nor did he tear down anything in Springfield at that time. So, that was a good thing, because there was no floor in this house. I mean, it was horrible, and I understand why the people were outraged, but the history was more important to save. Today, that's the way it has been preserved, and we're thrilled that this house was saved. Interpretive programs are being done inside. I was recently there a couple of months ago, and it almost brought me to tears to see what's going on there and how people have just embraced it. So it's a wonderful thing. They're still looking to put more furniture in there, but they are having programs there. Peter Byrd from Champaign County in Urbana. Urbana was a very active station, a very active area on the Underground Railroad. And Peter Byrd was quite well-to-do African-American who made a good living. And this was one of several houses that Peter had. And while he had his own wagon and he would transport goods during the day, he transported another type of good at night. And here we are in Findlay. You should be proud of this story because here are three of your noted operators from Findlay: Joe Merkel, R.B. Hurd, and David Adams. David Adams was born in Urbana, and then he moved to Springfield, and that's where he met and married his wife. And then he came to Findlay. He opened up the only black barbershop in town, and he ran his barbershop by day. He was an active Underground Railroad conductor here, and he would often take time away from barbering to hide runaways and wait till it was clear, quiet, dark, and he would get them all the way north, sometimes almost to the Canadian line. So there are many, many descendants of the Adams family, not the ones with the long dress and the long hair, but there are many descendants of the Adams family, and I talked to David Adams's great-granddaughter last night, and she says we are having our family, I think the family reunion for next year, they will be celebrating 100 years. The Adams family is a part of the first families of Ohio. So, Yay for Findlay, for that. This is your story. Moving on up into Hardin County, we have another couple of Quakers, Sarah and Obadiah Williams, and this little house is still standing. And Quakers, Quakers don't tell a lie. That was one of their, principles, that they do not lie, which is very interesting because they were Underground Railroad conductors, and when bounty hunters came searching for them, there are lots of ravines out in the back of their house in this area. They were looking for runaways, and because they didn't believe a person could be a slave, they told the bounty hunters, no, we have not seen any. But they were there because they were upstairs in one of the bedrooms, and so they were invited in the house for supper. And Obadiah said a very long prayer over the food. And he prayed and he prayed and he prayed over the food. And the runaways can hear the praying. And that's giving them time to get out of the back entrance into the ravine. The old Ridgeville Congregational Church, and Congregationalists are another group of religious people who were very active abolitionists. They did not support slavery at all in the country. I do not believe that the Ridgeville Congregational Church is still active as a church, but it is still there. But when it was active, runaways would be taken into the church through this back entrance, and they would be given food and clothing, and if they were sick, whatever the church could do for them, they would do. And then they would load them up on wagons and get them on further north, up in the Sylvania, Toledo area, or sometimes over into Michigan, into Adrian, Michigan, because that's where a huge Quaker settlement was. We're in Sylvania in Lucas County, and I believe it was the cameraman who, when I was doing my little interview with him, talked about he knew where Sylvania was, and he knew where the Lathrop House was because he had done a filming there. The Lathrop House was moved off of its original site and placed on another site very close. I was not really happy with that. The Catholic Church there they wanted to actually tear it down and build a parking lot there for their school. That did not happen, so the house was moved, which I'm glad they did move for that reason. But Lathrop was known as the Night Hawk because he worked with another man, David Haroon, who had a huge barn and a trail between the two, and Lathrop would many times get these runaways on an actual train and get them over into Michigan. And today, his house is being restored. This is our Underground Railroad marker, and this was I was there that day to dedicate this marker. I think it's been about 4 years ago. And the house is being restored as the house itself, but it will also serve as a house museum. This is a very interesting story, and one that has come to me within the last year or so from Portsmouth. We are on our second leg of this journey. And this is the Wills L. Hutchins house. It is no longer there. It was a funeral home for many years. It's been torn down. Hutchins was a supporter of Abraham Lincoln. And he said that what Lincoln was doing in terms of writing the Emancipation Proclamation was a good thing, because that would totally drive out the Confederacy over time. And Hutchins was married and was away from home a lot, but he was also a very active abolitionist, and he no doubt knew and worked with, when he could, Captain William McLean, who was a boat captain there on the Ohio River going between Kentucky and Portsmouth. Now, Portsmouth was very active station, or active route, I'll say, but many runaways could not stay in Portsmouth because it was too dangerous. So they were always going further north, up that 23, what we know today as a Route 23 corridor. Wells would take them in his home. He had a wife, and he would hide runaways. But when he had to leave, it was only the wife that was left. She was afraid of the runaways. So what should have been a safe haven for them became a prison for them when the husband was not at home. The wife would have them chained upstairs in a room until her husband got back. I just, for when I heard the story, I thought, no, this just can't be. And I said, but Kathy, you have read all kind of crazy stuff, so you know it's probably true. But the chains were found in the house, and so before they tore this down, those chains were found. So apparently it did happen. But in Tranquility, which I love the name, in Adams County, is the John T.Wilson house. John T.Wilson was born in Brown County, so he was born where Ripley is. When his parents died, they left him quite a bit of money. And he started their first bank in Ripley. But he left Ripley and he came here. This is in the middle of nowhere. It sits up on a ridge. It is the most beautiful place I've ever been to, and it's very tranquil. And so he built the little log cabin. That was well before he built the brick house. He built a log cabin and used it as a store. And how Tranquility got its name, so I'm told, is that when he would order goods, or if he went to Cincinnati to buy goods to bring them there, the people didn't know where to ship them to. And he was asked one day by the shopkeeper, and he says, well, Mr. Adams, where do you want us to ship these goods to? The town hadn't been named yet. He said, just send them to Tranquility in Adams County, and that's how it got its name. After he made quite a bit of money, he built the brick house, and it's in the brick house where he would hire runaway slaves. He was totally against slavery. He was in our legislation in Ohio, and he would go on to become a congressman. He would fight in the Civil War. He lost his wife, and he did not have any children. And it was just him. And so he really became the hero of Adams County as well as Brown County, quite the philanthropist. And that's John T. there. And to celebrate that history, we erected an Underground Railroad marker there. And every September, I think it's the second week of September, they have a festival there. And the proprietors there open up their house for tours. And they have all sorts of activities for children and for adults on the property. So if you ever find your way to Tranquility, make sure you see this site. I'm in Tanglewood in Ross County. Tanglewood and the next site were two very active stations in Ross County. Now, Ross County had a number of Underground Railroad stations, but in Chillicothe, these two were the principal ones. Today, Tanglewood can still be seen. It's privately owned, and in that cupola, the owner, the person who built the home, Richard Douglas, would put a candle in that cupola. But if that candle was not burning, that meant bounty hunters are in the area. Do not stop. You'll have to go on, and go on to the next site. Well, this is one of 3 hiding places that can still be seen in the house. If that was not safe, then you had to go up the road to Payne Hill. Now, Payne Hill was the manse for the Presbyterian Church, and that church still operates, and the manse is still there. The first time that I was in this manse, I had heard about it. I had a number of friends. I had one of my regional coordinators living in Chillicothe, and she said, Kathy, you've got to see this house. So the pastor and his wife were living there at the time, and the wife's name was Bonnie. And so when I came, Bonnie said, well, Kathy, I hear that you've been wanting to see the house. Happy that you're here, and you want to see the tunnel. Now, I know everyone hears us about all these tunnels, and there is no tunnel from the Ohio River to Lake Erie. That is not true. And most tunnels were built for some other purpose, not for the Underground Railroad. But they did have a part of a tunnel there that led out to a little creek. And that's George Rennick. He'd freed his slaves from Virginia and brought them to Chillicothe. They helped build his house, and then they moved on and started their own free black settlement called the PP settlement after Peter Patrick. Well, anyway, back to this house. So Bonnie says, well, Kathy, go ahead on down. You access the basement from the kitchen. She had the kitchen door open, and I went down. She had the light on, and I went down, and I was really amazed of this very pristine tunnel. But then I noticed that Bonnie wasn't down here, so I hollered back up the steps. And I said, well, Bonnie, are you going to come down? You know, and she said, oh, no. She said, there are snakes down there. I'm not coming down there. So I got back up the steps as quick as I could, and I don't think I've been back to the manse since then. But great sight. And the church had a sister church in Mississippi. And they were outraged with their sister church because their sister church still kept slaves. And so they wrote either 7-point or 9-point missile to the church, asking them to do the right thing. God did not mean for anyone to be enslaved. Free your slaves, but they did not. Moving on into Circleville, into Pickaway County is the Samuel Moore House. Pickaway County was a little iffy about helping runaway slaves. I mean, it's not that they didn't, agree with it, but they knew what the penalties were, and they were just very, very careful. So Samuel Moore had been in the Civil War. He was a very quiet man. He talked to very few about what he was doing, but he would use this home as a safe haven for runaways. And he worked with a free black man who worked for the butcher. And it was often George Stanhope, the free black man in town, who was taking the runaway slaves to freedom, really literally still up on that 23 corridor into Columbus, because he always had access to the wagon. And now you're in Franklin County, where I live in Columbus, and this is the Kelton House. And the Kelton House was built in 1852 by Fernando Kelton and his wife Sophia. They lived, before building this house, they lived downtown. If you know where the Greyhound bus station is in downtown Columbus, that's where their house was. Sophia was tired of living downtown. She said it was dirty, it was noisy, and she wanted to move to the country. So the house I just showed you was in the country. It is literally downtown today. However, she and other women were a part of something called the anti-slavery sewing circles. These were just like a quilting bee. You go and you cross stitch. And this was a potholder. This was a very favorite pattern during that time because they would sell these at anti-slavery bazaars and raise quite a bit of money for the cause of ridding the country of slavery and for helping runaways gain their freedom. Any holder but a slaveholder. This woman is probably the last picture of her alive. This is Martha Hartaway. Martha Hartaway was probably 10 years old, and her sister, Pearl, who was older, maybe 13, when their mother, all three of them enslaved in Powhatan County, Virginia, was told on this particular day, the master has said you have come of age and you will now be transplanted in the big house. And I'm sure most of us know what that means or what it could mean. And I know that mother was very fearful of her daughters going to the big house. I'm sure these daughters had no idea what could happen to them. And somehow, we don't know how, passage was made for them. They had a brother living free in Columbus. We don't know, did the mother know how to write? Did she know where her free son in Columbus, Ohio was? Did she somehow get a letter to her son and say, be on the lookout for your sisters? We don't know. But on one day, the Kelton family, Sophia, found these two girls hiding outside near the cistern. She took them in. Pearl would not talk. And finally, Pearl goes away. We don't know where she goes until she's older, and we find out she winds up in Wisconsin. We only know that because well after the war, her little sister Martha is writing letters to her and is going to visit her. But Martha was little, she was frail, and the Kelton family took her in, and they raised her with their 6 very well-to-do children. And it is the most amazing story. We've gotten this from the descendants. And as I say, this is the last picture of her before she died, as she was stoking a fire. This was much later on at the fireplace, and an ember caught the edge of her skirt, and she went up in flame. But she didn't marry. And this is the brother. So obviously they were probably mulattoes. So her brother was living free in Columbus. And we don't know how, if he found his girl, found his sisters or not. We just still do not know. That's Thomas Lawrence. Martha married Thomas. He was a free black man from Caddos, Ohio. That's where Steubenville is, if you know that area. He came to Ohio. He was living in the western part of Columbus named Galloway, or a little town called Galloway, and he was looking for work. The war is over, and he comes to the Kelton house, and he's a skilled carpenter. And Martha's still there. She's grown. She probably now knows how to read and write, maybe. She's probably has been doing some domestic work for the Keltons, and they get married in the front parlor of the Kelton house. So the house that gave them freedom, gave her freedom, they get married in the front parlor, and married. I'll tell that in just a moment. Thomas Lawrence, after they got married, he's working downtown. This is a city worker in our old city hall, which was torn down. And if you've ever been to the Ohio Theater, I think it's the Ohio Theater, that's where the old city hall was. But we even found a picture of Martha doing laundry, and these pictures are very recent that we just came across these. As I said, she died in a fire, but she was married by Reverend James Poindexter, and he was quite well known. He was the minister of the anti-slavery Baptist church for a few years before he rejoined the church back. Going on up into Morrow County at the Reuben Benedict House, this is the Quaker settlement. This is the Alum Creek settlement. So all Quakers are living in this Alum Creek settlement, and the Alum Creek is going right through there. And this is a hotbed for abolition because they're all Quakers living up there. They're all buried in the cemetery up there. And runaways are being told to find the Quaker settlement. And bounty hunters know where it is too. So they're always up there looking for runaway slaves. And so this is the Reuben Benedict House. That house was built in the very early 1820s, and the first time I saw it, it really hadn't changed much, but I told them if they took that satellite dish out the yard, it would look a little bit more historic. Reuben Benedict, but then his nephew, Aaron L. Benedict, living down the street, or living down the road, and he and his wife, Phoebe, are very well known in sheltering runaway slaves. Phoebe, in fact, has made herself a rug on her spinning wheel right in the parlor when you come in. And they're Quakers, and she has a hiding place so she can roll up her rug and she can open up this trap door and runaways can go down in there. And so she would have a big conch shell. And when runaways would go up in this area, the Quakers would hire them so they could make money, to earn some money to keep going further north if they wanted to. And so when danger was lurking, Phoebe would get out her conch shell and she'd pull that rug up and she'd get out in the yard and she'd blow that shell, and that was a signal for the runaways to get in the house, and she had the trap door open and they can get in there and hide until the danger was over. I got bitten by a snake at that house too, but that's another story. As we come to the end of our second journey here, you're in Sandusky. This is the old church. This old log church, was founded by Nathaniel Jones. He had been enslaved. He was freed, and he would go around and preach about his time as being enslaved. And that's the church today. Now, the people came to me years and years ago when I was on the preservation board. They wanted to put the church on the National Register. We couldn't do it because it had been compromised, the National Register folks said, because they had added that brick tower and the church was brick. over time, we researched it enough where that wooden church, that log church, was never torn down. It was inside of this church. They just bricked it over, and we were able to put this site on the National Register. And it deserved to be on the National Register because that was a hotbed of abolition. When you got that far north in the firelands in Sandusky, runaways were pretty well safe. Some of them went to Canada. Bounty hunters would go there, but they could never get runaways out of there because these people were fierce. And they put up their own marker years ago. And Captain Thomas McGee, he was a boat captain. His house is still standing there. It's a private home, but he still had men, free men, who were the sons of their fathers who had fought in the War of 1812 up there on the lake. So their sons now are working for him, and he is giving them money and allowing them to use his boats to take people to Canada if they still do not feel free or safe in Sandusky. So now we're on our last leg of the journey, and we're down back at the river, Howard River, in Gallipolis, Ohio. And this is the Mutual Aid Society. This is the building. It's a rental home now, and it's not in very good condition. But the Mutual Aid Society, I like to think of the Mutual Aid Societies as being the forerunner of the United Way, because this would be the group of people who would raise money for free people, runaways, money for clothing, money for food, money sending the children to school, trying to educate them. So they did everything they could for the newly freed person or the person who was trying to get his or her freedom. But when I really think of the Underground Railroad, I just think of this. I don't think of anybody's church, anybody's house, anybody's attic, anybody's cellar. I just think of Poke Patch. Because if you remember, I showed you Longtown over in Dark County, another transracial community of whites, free blacks, and Native Americans all working together and using their area, which is no longer there. I mean, the land is there, it's owned by the Wayne National Forest, but very few houses, if any, are left. But very tucked away, and a lot of natural caves and coves that runaways could hide in. This church is gone. This is the old Poke Patch Church. The men who are standing there had been enslaved and had gotten their freedom and came there, settled there, and built that church. But working with the Wayne National Forest in GPR, ground penetrating radar, we think we have found the foundation of this church. They do have a new church, Poke Patch Church, and there are several USCT, United States Colored Troops soldiers, buried in the cemetery. Here's a story you'll never find anywhere other than southeastern Ohio, because these are iron furnaces. And the man who owned this furnace and several other furnaces was very agreeable to allowing free black men come there and work, and runaway slaves come there and work. And he would hide them near the furnace. Affadilla Deaver, her husband founded Deavertown in Morgan County, and she has to be my favorite because just of that look on her face. It's like she's not taking nothing off of anybody. And so Affadilla Deaver's husband was not there one evening when she was hiding runaways, and I've been in that house. And it was raining, of course, because it's Ohio, it always rains. And she was trying to get runaways to, I think, either the 5 Mile house or the 2 Mile house outside of Zanesville. She was not trying to get them to Zanesville because that was pro-slavery then. So she had no choice. So she loads them up in her wagon. And of course, bounty hunters stopped her. They found her. And they said that they were going to search her wagon because they knew runaways were in this area. And she says, well, you can search if you like, she says, and I do have some people in there, she says, but they have a horrible, horrible disease. You look at them, you're gonna catch it. And she went into very, very details about what they look like. And so the men decided, okay, we'll fix the wagon wheel and let her pass. And but I was in that house, and why I love this house is the couple who lived there, they're deceased now, told me that in this little room that they took me in, there was an escaping slave mother with child, a woman with child, and she had that baby in this room. And I had to think about that for a minute, because here's a runaway slave woman carrying a baby who has it in a house in Ohio, and Ohio is a free state. So the question is the baby free, or is the baby still a slave? Now that's going to be the question we'll get to in a little bit. It'll be a test afterwards. All right, I'm in Washington County near Marietta at the James and Margaret Smith House in Cutler. And another interesting story about this house, it's out in the middle of nowhere, and there are ravines and caves back there. But James and Margaret Smith allowed runaways to stay there. But when a bounty hunter came one particular morning or afternoon, he said that he was looking for runaways and wanted to search the house and had papers to search the house. And if you see those 5 windows up above the house, the Smiths had 5 sons, and a gun came out of each window. And so the bounty hunter thought a little bit about that and went on. However, their family never wanted anyone to forget about how this family, or what this family did in terms of helping runaways seek their freedom. So they took an old millstone in 1940s and had their own plaque built on it, made on it. Station number 1, and I have never been able to understand what station number 1 was. Was it station number 1 in Cutler? Was it station number 1 in Washington County? I don't know. And it stood right across the street from the house. It has since been moved to a little underground railroad museum in Belpre, Ohio, which sits along the Ohio River. Nelson T. Gant came from Virginia. He had paid for his freedom from his master, and his master said, "You are free to go." His wife, however, was not free. So Nelson came to Ohio. He knew if he could just get to a free state and earn some money, he could go back to Virginia and buy his wife. So when he came to the Zanesville area, he got with some abolitionists, both white and black, and they helped Nelson raise the money. And he went back to Virginia and he bought his wife out of slavery, and they settled in Virginia, or settled in Ohio. He became a millionaire. This man ventured in all sorts of endeavors and made good at it. That's his house. It has been restored. The part on the left used to be a bar. We're not doing that anymore. So now it's used, it's a historical site, and it's used for meetings and tours and whatnot, and it has been restored. And we've got an Underground Railroad marker there. And there are a number of things in Zanesville named after Mr. Gant. He's got parks and schools and all kinds of things named after him, so quite a success story. And still there in Zanesville is the Putnam Presbyterian Church, but we're in Putnam, not Zanesville. Putnam was anti-slavery across the river. Zanesville was pro-slavery, and these two factions fought all the time. And Frederick Douglass, of whom I'm sure we all know, when he came to Ohio one of the 4 or 5 times he visited, he came to this church, and he preached this church to encourage the locals to do everything they could to help get rid of slavery in this country. And the pastor at the time was Reverend Beecher. Why do we know that Beecher name? That sounds familiar. Harry Beecher Stowe's brother. Harry Beecher Stowe's brother was the first pastor of the church. And for a time he lived in Circleville, and then he came to Zanesville. But it was really Reverend Kingsbury who was the one who was very, very active in abolition. Okay. Battery gone, or don't know. Anybody here know? You could do it? Okay, all right. All right, we're in Newcomerstown, and in Tuscarawas County. And where this tavern, this Temperance Tavern is where the Ohio and Erie Canal ran right in front of the house. So in this part of Ohio, the canal was used to transport runaways, but it depended if you were from Pennsylvania or had that Pennsylvania mindset, or if you were from Virginia and you had the Virginia mindset. Those were the ones that would not carry anyone who was trying to run away on their canal boat. Joshua Cope and James Van Pelt. These are Quakers. They're living over in the St. Clairsville area. And they go to the Wheeling Market House. Next slide. Because on the Saturday mornings, these Quakers can go to the market house, they can buy goods, and on the second floor, they can buy slaves. So the auction of slaves was inside this market. It had to have been a sight of these two Quaker men with these wide brim hats and their very thick brogue, purchasing slaves. For what reason? To get them back, because this is Wheeling, Virginia. There was no West Virginia yet. So this is Wheeling, Virginia. So they're buying them to get them back across the river into the free state of Ohio and to get them free. In Jefferson County, in Mount Pleasant, is the Benjamin Lundy House. On one side, Benjamin Lundy lived in, on the other side was his free labor store. And that's a vintage photo of it. Next one. Benjamin Lundy was very young when he came to the Mount Pleasant area. Actually, that was his second place because he'd already been in St. Clairsville. He didn't live long. He died when he was in his 30s. But Benjamin Lundy wrote one of the first abolitionist newspapers, the Universal Genius of Man, I think it was. And next slide. But he ran a free labor store. And the only free labor store still standing today is in Ohio, in Mount Pleasant. All the rest of them are gone. Free labor stores were stores where Quakers would sell goods not made by slave hands. So if the cotton shirt you are wearing, that cotton was picked by slaves, they would not sell that shirt. And he had fire and brimstone business cards that he would distribute as he went out. So, shall we walk in glistening raiment through untold oppression gain, when by blood and tears and sorrow, every thread is stained. Stained with what? Stained with the blood of slaves. Next. It's George Fox, who's the founder of the Society of Friends, the Quakers, and he realizes in the 1600s, when they are slaveholders, that what we are doing is against God. And so Quakers start to free their slaves. They all come north because freed black people could not stay free in a slave state. They were given a year to get out, otherwise they would be re-enslaved. Next. David Hudson is the founder of Hudson, Ohio. Next. And he's the founder of an institute there. I'm trying to think of the name of it. It escapes me for a moment. But he was the founder of Hudson. This is his house, very active conductor, and a very good friend of John Brown's father, Owen Brown. Next. Here's Owen. Next. And Owen Brown was a member of the First Congregational Church. He was not happy with the people in the church. He did not think the people in the church was doing enough to rid the country of slavery. He didn't think they were active enough to be in abolition. So he took his money out of that church and he built his own church on the public green. This house or this site is no longer a church, but it's still there. And he made everybody sign like a affidavit swearing what they would do to work in abolition. His son, John Brown, would preach on the steps. He actually would read the Declaration of Independence on the steps of this church on July the 4th, 1852. December of 1852, he was hanged. Richard Elson Flouring Mill. The mill is still there. The house is not there. But Richard Elson took a flatboat and went down the Ohio River to New Orleans for goods. When he got there, he got the shock of his life. He saw his first slave auction. He literally saw these people being marched, handcuffed, hands and feet. He was horrified. He wrote a letter to his mother, telling his mother what he had seen, and that when he got back, they must do all that they can do to help people get their freedom. So they used the house at the time, it's no longer standing, there's a little pocket park there with a marker, and the flour mill to hide runaway slaves in this county, Stark County, which actually was very active. Next. And getting close to the end, imagine running away in all this snow. This is the Daniel Howe Heist House. I have to say that slowly because I haven't had all my coffee yet for today. But there was a third peak in the middle. That peak burned, so there was only 2 peaks left. But Daniel Howe Heist, next, they said he had fire red hair. Now, it doesn't show that in this black and white picture, but they said he had red hair, and he supported the women's rights to vote, because this is in Salem, and he supported abolition, and he kept many a runaway there in his house. And I think it was underneath that third peak that had been burned. Next, because when I went in there, it's a huge area. And when the owners took me down in this area, they said this is where Daniel would hide the runaways until he could get them to a little bit more safer place. Next. And I'm back at the Ohio, at the Erie, Lake Erie, to William Hubbard's house, to Colonel William Hubbard, and he always kept a boat in Ashtabula Harbor. His house is a museum, so you can visit it today. But he always kept a boat there in case he had the opportunity of getting people who felt they still were not feeling freedom or had been chased that far. He could take them across the river to Canada. So he always was at the ready. The Unionville Tavern here, when I first went there, because the Unionville Tavern is the oldest tavern in Ohio. And it does have tunnels. Next. It's between Lake County and in Lake County when you leave Ashtabula. So right on the county line. That's the way it looks today. I was horrified 4 years ago when I saw this. But it's being restored. And I'm just thrilled. And so they have so much support now because it was falling in, and the townspeople really didn't want it there. They knew the history, but it is being saved. Next, and that's just 2 years ago. It's got a new roof, at least. And it now, as I understand, looks even better. Next. So the proprietor at that time, years ago, says, "Do you want to see the tunnels?" Oh, yeah, I do. So you go in the tunnel, and the tunnels led across the road to a cemetery. Next. And supposedly, in this cemetery that's still there, there was a wagon at this particular grave, false grave, nobody in it. So a wagon was always kept there at this false grave. So when you went in the tunnel and you wound on out underneath the road across to the cemetery, then you'd get in the wagon and that conductor would take you to the lake. So I thought, well, I wonder where that is. So when I stood in the cemetery, I thought, okay, well, where is it? They didn't know where it was. So the group that's working on the house was bound and determined to do their research, and they have dragged out every book, paper, everything to see if they can find this grave. So working with the cemetery. Next. Oh, let me go back. Go back one. Oh, nope. That's all right. Yep. So it is under this stone. There is nobody buried there. and they found it. And I kind of had a hunch that where I was standing at the tavern at an angle, I knew it had to be on that particular side of the cemetery. I just didn't know exactly where. They went through, with GPR, they went through that whole cemetery, and that is the only site that does not have a grave. So that is where the false bottom, or the false grave was. Okay, now. So I'm gonna close with this tunnel entrance, but I don't know where it is. I found this picture at the Ohio History Connection years and years ago, because in their files, someone said, we think it's in Cleveland, somewhere in Cleveland, but we just don't know. And I was always haunted by this picture, because I would think, I wonder how many runaways came down those steps and found freedom, or how many runaways came down those steps only to be reshackled because the bounty hunter, their owner, was there, or the sheriff or whatever. And so given a presentation a few years ago near the Cleveland area, a young girl said, "Miss Nelson, I think I know where that is." I said, "Oh, well, where is it?" She says, "I think it's a Mexican restaurant now." I thought, oh, I hope not. That is not what I want to see this site be. Now, I do a presentation 3 years later, and one of my researchers who does a lot with historic cemeteries, Bill said, "I do think it might be in Cleveland." He says, "And I think it may be a part of the where the nuns live, where I want to say, the convent." He says, "I think this might have been a part of the convent." I thought, oh, thank God. That makes a lot more sense. All right. So the next and last slide. I would like to recite something to you as I close, as you are watching this picture. I want to read to you the creed, or the mission statement, if you will, of the American Anti-Slavery Society of 1843. This is what they said: "If you come to us and are hungry, we will feed you. If thirsty, we will give you drink. If naked, we will clothe you. If sick, we will administer to your necessities. If in prison, we will visit you. But if you need a hiding place from the face of the pursuer, we will provide one that even the bloodhounds won't scent out. And you have come to the end of your journey." Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has a question before it starts raining and I had to beat it home. Any questions?
The question is if you have a book with all of what you've presented so we can take the tour ourselves.
We wrote a book, the Friends of Freedom Society wrote a book several years ago. It's no longer, it was self-published. It's no longer in print, unfortunately. But you can probably find it on Amazon. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Well, I know.